if you are here joining us in this panel, it's because you probably also like stuffed animals. Whether you like to look at them or you like to collect them. But if you're like me, you might be a fan of things that you can't easily find plushies for. Maybe you have a favorite character that they never made merch for. Maybe you like somebody who's obscure in the series. You don't like the main protagonist. You like the oddball supporting character. Or maybe you're a fan of old school Japanese RPGs, and if they ever made merchandise, they never brought it over to this country. So you would see pictures, grainy little pictures online of, oh, they made a plush that now costs $500. And $500 is far too much for a kind of derpy little cat thing. Or maybe you're a fan of something that's brand new. For example, this is from a game called Pal World that just came out maybe a month, 2 months ago. And there's no official plushies for this, but I saw this little critter and I wanted one because it's soft and fluffy and it looks like such a little baby, kind of like an Eevee. But there's no official plushies for this either. So I decided to make one. And today I'm going to tell you that if you would like to give plush making a try, you can get all the supplies you need to get started for about $60. And about half of that cost is going to be your fabric scissors. If you're somebody who sews already, you might already have some of this in your stash. So before you get started working on a plush, I recommend you start with a pattern so you have an idea of what you need to get started. And I have a list of some websites with QR codes of places where I've gotten some patterns and some materials. But if you're brand new to this, there's a pattern designer I recommend. Her name online is Chully Knight. She has very beginner-friendly patterns. She is very detailed with her instructions, lots of pictures for every step, and she very much walks you through the process. She will also tell you exactly what you need, how much yardage of what kinds of fabrics. If you're brand new to plush making, I recommend starting with fleece fabric. And I'll talk more about fabrics in a bit, but fleece is something you can go to Joann Fabrics and buy right off the shelf. They often put it on sale, and it's a good plush making material. You're also going to need stuffing, because otherwise you're going to have just a little flat thing sewn together. It won't be very cuddly if you don't have stuffing inside. You'll need thread to sew the plush together. You're going to need scissors, and this is where I said if you're somebody who doesn't sew yet, you're going to need a set of fabric scissors. I definitely recommend shopping around because you can buy them at Joann Fabrics, but they will cost a whole lot more if they're not already on sale. And you can buy the exact same scissors for about half the cost at Walmart. You're also going to need pins to hold your pieces together when you're sewing. And you can hand sew the entire plush together if you don't have a sewing machine. I like to use a sewing machine for mine, but even if you use a sewing machine, you still need a hand sewing needle to finish up the plush at the end, because you will sew your pieces, you will put your stuffing in, and you will still need to close up that hole at the end. No matter how long you have been sewing, you will always need this. This is a seam ripper. I've been sewing for almost 20 years, and not a single project goes by that I don't need to take something apart. Whether I sewed something in the wrong spot, or some of the fabric flipped over on itself, or a hole's not quite big enough to flip it the right way, you will always need a seam ripper. And then finally, another tool that's useful that you might not expect is a chopstick. You can get a chopstick if you go and get takeout at Panda Express. Just ask for chopsticks with your dinner. They'll give you a set of little wooden chopsticks. And it's really useful for flipping your pieces inside out, especially if it has sharp edges. It's really hard if you have something like long ears like this or long skinny tails like Mew has over here. It's really hard to get your fingers all the way at the end to work stuffing in, but chopsticks are really helpful for that. So the big question with plush making is what kind of fabric do you use and where do you get it? So you don't have to follow all these recommendations, but you're going to get a different result depending on what you use. The very first plushie I ever made is this guy from Katamari Damacy. He is the prince. I had no idea what I was doing. So he is made out of a combination of spandex fabric, because it was the right color green, He's got satin fabric on his trim, cotton, pipe cleaners, fabric paint, a pom-pom. He's a hodgepodge. He's not very cuddly. His head is very floppy. He's sun faded out like crazy because of Texas. So if you don't use plush materials, you can still get something that's usable, but it's not really going to be cuddly. I wouldn't be able to cuddle with him too well. So what I'm going to talk about some different materials. The first material I'm going to talk about is felt, and I will pass around some samples. This is a full little plushie made out of felt. Felt is not terribly soft. It's inexpensive. You can get it at Joann's in sheet form. And I wouldn't recommend using it for an entire plush because it doesn't stretch, and it's kind of hard. And it's kind of hard to get nice rounded shapes. But what felt is great for is details because it doesn't fray when you cut it. On the flower crown here on Pikachu, all these little flowers are made out of felt. They look really great. You don't have to worry about squishing it or cuddling this part of it, but it gives you a really nice effect. I also used felt when I first started off to make the eyeballs on things because, again, it doesn't fray. You can glue it right on top and you can get some nice detailed eyes. The next material that I'm going to talk about is cotton. When you think about cotton stuffed animals, you might think like Raggedy Ann dolls or patchwork teddy bears. You can get cotton in a lot of different patterns and styles. You can get it in the quilting section at Joann's. It's not terribly soft, but you can make a stuffed animal out of it. The problem is it doesn't stretch. And because cotton doesn't stretch, you have to really pack the stuffing in there to get a rounded seam. It doesn't want to go in there. And when you do that, you're going to put strain on the seams and cotton will fray. So when I was sewing this, I had to put fabric glue here at the point to reinforce it because just in the time I sewed it and stuffed it, this was already starting to burst at the seam. So yes, you can make something out of cotton, but you're going to have some problems. It's also not terribly cuddly. I mean, it's sort of like a pillow, kind of think like a stuffed full pillowcase. It does have a nice rustic look. If you want something that's a little bit creepy looking, kind of a little bit voodoo doll for Halloween, that's a good look for that. The next fabric I'm going to talk about is fleece. And fleece is one that I recommend for plush making, especially if you're new. Fleece has a stretch to it. Fleece is soft. You can stuff it full. You can get nice rounded shapes. It's soft and cuddly. This little pony here is all made out of fleece. It's pretty durable. Comes in lots of colors. You can buy it at Joann Fabrics. It often goes on sale. So it's a really good starter material for plushies. These little guys here have their clothes and hair made out of fleece. You can see it looks pretty good. The only drawback to fleece really is that if you love on it a whole lot, it's gonna get pilled. And this is one that I made with my kid. And this is SCP-999 from the SCP Foundation series. But you see, since it's been loved on, it's not quite as soft anymore. It's kind of got the little bumps on it. It's gonna look more worn out if you really cuddle it and love on it. Which brings us to what I make most of my plushies out, which is a fabric called Minky. Minky has a stretch to it. It is a furry kind of fabric. So it's got like little furry fibers, has a nice soft feel to it. If you buy plushies in the dealer's room, like Pokemon plushies or Nintendo plushies, a lot of those are made out of some variety of Minky. The problem with Minky is that when you cut it, it will shred little bits everywhere. It'll look like you had a pet in the house. You need to either pull on the edges or use a sticky backed lint roller, which is what I do, to get up some of the fluff. The other thing with Minky is that it's difficult to source locally. You're gonna have to go online if you wanna buy Minky, because Joann's carries a few colors, but not very much variety. And theirs isn't very good quality. Online, there are a lot of sellers that carry Minky. On my resources list over there, I have some links to Etsy shops that I've used and had great experience with. The final material I'm going to talk about in detail is what's called mochi. Mochi is your squishmallow fabric. It's very soft. It's incredibly stretchy. And if you want the squishmallow effect, you can use a certain kind of stuffing as opposed to the standard polyfill to really give you that squishy look. An interesting thing about working with mochi, Silk Espeon is made from mochi. Since it is so stretchy, your finished plushie will be extra big. The Sylveon, it's the little creepy patchwork one, and the Espeon were made using the same base pattern. Sylveon's a little bit creepy and underfed, whereas Espeon looks like it ate all the rare candy today. He's very soft, he's very squishy, but he will eat a lot of stuffing. And it will give you a different effect. Almost everything else up here is made from Minky, so you can kind of compare the differences. When I'm talking about Minky also, it's not just the smaller pile of fur. Pile is the length of your fabric, of the little fibers. This guy is also made of a different type of Minky, which the fibers are much longer, which makes him a whole lot softer. But again, with more softness, longer pile, also means it's going to shed a whole lot more. And this guy over here, this shed really bad when I was working on it, because you can see how long his little hair is. That went everywhere. But it makes a really good long-haired effect. And finally, there's a couple other materials you can use when you're plush making. For the skin on these dolls, I use something called craft velour. This is used more in traditional doll making. It doesn't have a stretch to it, but it also doesn't shed. But it comes in a lot of skin tone colors. One of the problems with fleece and Minky is that it's more difficult to find flesh tones, particularly Caucasian flesh tones. You can find beautiful browns and caramel colors, but light peach is harder to find. There's a handful of sellers that do carry it, and again, I've linked them up here, but it's more of a rarer thing to find. It's a whole lot easier to find bright, colorful fabric colors. And finally, you can use fake fur, like triples. It's very soft and fluffy, but it has no stretch. So some of the same problems you're going to have with cotton, you're going to have with faux fur, which is why it's not traditionally used in handmade stuffed animals. You're going to see like antique teddy bears made out of longer piled fur, but it's not really something that a home sewer is going to use as much. It does make nice little fluffy triple friends though. And this is one of my other first plushies I ever made, and faux fur is used on him too, and feathers for the wings. He also has felt for his eyes and mouth. You can see that's glued on there. Talking about where you buy fabric. And as I mentioned earlier, if you want fleece, go to Joann's. You have a wide variety. They carry tons of fleece in all seasons, which you can use it great for stuffed animals. Not a whole lot of other uses in the summer in Texas for fleece, but it makes great plushies. If you want Minky, you're going to be shopping online. You're not going to find a lot of it locally, even if you go to the fabric district on Perth Street. And finally, if you want mochi, I only know of one fabric seller who carries it, but they have a website. Their company is Big Z Fabrics, and they carry their own line of mochi in a variety of colors. There's also a couple of different kinds of stuffing you can use for your plushies. Typically, I like what's called just standard polyfill or soft and crafty. It's what most of the plushies up here are made with. It packs in well, so you can get a nice, well-sculpted plush, but it's not super, super soft. If you want something like a squishmallow, this is called silky soft. You can feel it is a whole lot squishier, but because it's so squishy, it works really well for like little pillows or squishmallow style. But if you're trying to sculpt something and like really get detail, like stuff a nose on an animal, you're gonna have trouble getting that to pack in well. If you need something to be weighted, these are called poly pellets. They're tiny little plastic pellets, plastic beads. You can sew them into your stuffed animals. Think like Beanie Babies. This is what gives you that weight in the bottom. I would not recommend that you use beans or rice. because I have heard horror stories online of people who used actual beans or rice. The plush got wet. They got moldy, or in one case, they sprouted.
Yeah.
That's a horror movie right there. Teddy, no! Why are you growing?
Yeah.
So I would highly recommend you use the plastic beans because they work really well, they add weight. In fact, on some of these, they wouldn't be able to stand up at all if they didn't have them. The Dragonair has a really big, heavy head, so he has a poly pellet pouch in his little belly so that he will stand. That's kind of gravity defying without the beans.
You said it has a pouch in it. Do you like make a pouch full of pellets
I
and
do.
then sew it in?
I will sew like a little circle,
Yeah.
pour them in. I have like a tiny little measuring cup I will pour them into and use a spoon, sew it up, and I put it in with the stuffing. Depending on the animal, the pouches are in slightly different places. Like on Flareon here, if you squish his little feet, you can feel that I just sort of put them into the paws so he would stand. That's a lot. But otherwise he would flop over because he's got a big head too. Feel this little feet.
Big head equals extra cute.
He's extra cute, but it does mean that he's heavy.
I represent that remark. Yes. No,
So-
kind of heavy, extra cute.
The easiest way to get started making a stuffed animal is to start with something kind of like the little stars I passed around. You're going to have a pattern piece that you make that is just exactly the same on both sides. You'll sew up the edges. I have a darker line on these. I traced over it with Sharpie where I sewed, but you're going to have to make sure you leave a hole in the bottom, otherwise you won't be able to stuff it and flip it. So after you've sewn around the edges, you'll get in here and you'll flip this, and this is where a chopstick is really useful, because for this, it's not terribly big, but for things that have like really long ears or tails, it's more difficult to get in here and get these edges out. And be careful if you're trying to use scissors to pop out your edges because you might put a hole in it. That's why I like chopsticks, because they are blunt, and unlike a pencil, you don't have to worry about them leaving any marks behind.
A paintbrush handle can work as well too.
Absolutely, something that's not marking, but is narrow, but with a nice blunt end on it. Chopsticks are good, paintbrush handles are good. So you'll flip this right side out, add your stuffing here, and then you will hand sew up the hole in the bottom. And all the little stars I passed around were made exactly the same way. And if you look at the bottom edges on them, you can see that the stitching is a little bit different on that very bottom edge. So every piece here is made essentially the same way, where some part of it is hand sewn. And you may notice it's things like on the back of the head, places where you're not going to notice it as well. Yet usually a lot of the patterns call for it being like the back of the head, like underneath the tail or something, so that somebody who's looking at it for the first time, that's not going to be the first thing they see. You definitely don't want to put it in a noticeable place. Like this one, it's right here on this side. You really have to look to find it too. When you have maybe tried out your first couple patterns and you've done something simple, like two pieces sewn together, or you're an adventurous beginner, you want to try something new, there are different places you can get plush patterns. I have not invented most of these patterns. I either followed a pattern exactly, or I started from a pattern and made my own modifications. A few pattern designers that I recommend, as I had mentioned, Choli Knight. She is the designer for a great deal of what you see up here. Her stuff is very beginner friendly. She has embroidery files available for the faces if you have an embroidery machine. If not, she has instructions for how to do the faces without embroidery, applique and other different techniques. Some other pattern designers who I recommend, Teacup Lion designed this one, which I modified into Leafeon by changing out the ears, the tail, figuring out how to do the two different colors on the legs instead of just the one. And another designer who I really like is Dolphin Wing, who did this Mew pattern. This is a lot more complicated of a pattern compared to some of the simpler ones. I really like the effect. Mew is my personal favorite Pokemon, so I wanted to make this one. But you can see there's a lot more geometry that goes into this one to get the hips, the belly, the tail, the head shape. it's not quite so cutesy. So the more complicated the pattern is, the more detailed the end result will be. You can make really nice things from simple designs, but when you want things like a four-legged animal, that's going to take a bit more work. If you like traditional sewing patterns, you can go to the fabric store, look in the back of the pattern books, and you'll find things like Baby Yoda. There's also a lot of typical things like teddy bears, cute little animals. And if you go on Etsy and look at vintage patterns, you can even find things like Chunky Pikachu. And these come with tissue paper patterns along with instruction sheets. I think patterns are wonderful. I don't think I would be able to make anywhere near the stuff that I have here if I didn't have great base patterns to start with. But you are not limited to follow exactly what the pattern shows you. A couple examples. I made these Five Nights at Freddy's characters. These did not start off as a Five Nights at Freddy's pattern. In fact, this started off as zodiac animals for the Chinese zodiac. There was a bunny, and I thought the bunny would be a great start for Bonnie, but there was no bear in this pattern, so I modified the dog to give him the little Freddy ears. And then I made the hat and the accessories. This is also an example of mixing fabrics on your plush. The skin of the animals is the minky fabric, but the bow tie and the hat on Freddy is a stretch velvet, and this is a spandex fabric, because they don't make minky fabric that's something that's shiny or sparkly like this. So you can mix and match. Another sample of mixing and matching fabrics is this little raccoon that I made. She is a minky fabric for her body, but all of the clothes are made out of cotton. What's nice about this is some of the problems with sewing full plushies out of cotton, like worrying about packing it into the seams and the difficulty with the seams bursting, you won't have it all with this because the clothes aren't stuffed. It's just like making regular clothes for yourself. So you can mix and match. Think like Build-A-Bears, how when you buy a Build-A-Bear, it's a fluffy animal, but the clothes are something different.
That's where they get you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's the thing, is that if you make them yourself and you decide that you want, say, a Star Trek shirt for your bear, or you want a Doctor Who outfit for your bear,
Oh,
you
wait,
can
sorry,
make that
wrong
yourself.
Right convention.
Now, once you have been working on this for a while and you find that you like it, there's a handful of tool upgrades that you can do that make the process a little bit easier. I swear by these now. This is a water erasable marker. When I first started off, I was tracing all my pattern pieces with Sharpie before cutting them out. That was a bad idea, because Pikachu here, if you look really closely at his seams, or her seams, I used an orange Sharpie to trace them, and it started to bleed just a little bit through. It's not terribly noticeable because I used an orange, but like if I had used a black Sharpie to trace these pieces, you would just sort of see it coming through the edges on the seams where the pieces are connected. And that's really disappointing after you've put a lot of work into a plush to have it start to bleed on you. This has done really well for me because it is truly water erasable. I've used this for cosplay making too. When you spritz water on it, the ink just disappears. But it will last for as long as you need. I used it for sewing last year on an outfit that was fully white. Everything came off perfectly well. Another tool that I like, in addition to fabric scissors, this is a rotary cutter. Kind of looks like a little pizza wheel. You will need to have a mat under your work surface for when you cut out your pieces, but this is really good for bigger shapes. Things where if you had to pick it up and move it, because the minky fabric is slippery and it likes to move on you, if you can keep everything flat, you can go around the edges and cut out your pieces a whole lot easier than if you're using scissors. You're still going to need scissors for things like tiny little details. I mean, this is a small wheel, but you really can't get into tiny little points like scissors can. And finally, this is kind of an unusual tool. These are called hemostats. I got these out of an old first aid kit that was in my old car. These are nice for when you need to get stuffing into tiny areas. When I was working on Creepy Sylveon here, I could not get stuffing into the tail because it doesn't stretch. I could fill up this part, great, but my fingers were too big to get into these little points. You can grab stuffing in here and push it into your areas there. It's also useful if you need to flip things right side out and they have long skinny pieces like tails and long ears. So that's another nice thing to pick up. Not terribly expensive, but really can help you out if you want to do more detailed plush work. Sewing machine too. If you want to get started and you're not somebody who sews, it is possible to hand sew all of your plush. There are lots of people out there who do just that. I like to use a sewing machine for most of the work, and you don't have to use anything too fancy. In fact, I'm still using my starter sewing machine that I got way back when I first started cosplaying. All you really need is a straight stitch and a zigzag stitch. You don't need computerized things. You don't need anything too terribly complicated. And I'm still using my baseline machine. You can get one for about $100 to $200. If you really get into this and you really enjoy plush making and you want to make everything ever, you may consider an embroidery machine. Embroidery machines are much more of an investment. Expect to pay between $1,000 to $2,000 depending on the hoop size of the machine. And the hoop size is how much usable area you have per design. A lot of pattern designers will include the embroidery files with the patterns, either when you buy them or the freebies. And almost everything you see up here has embroidered eyes. A lot of them were things that came with the pattern. If you really want to get fancy, you can buy special software that lets you design your own embroidery. But sometimes that can be a couple $1,000s as well, plus the learning curve for it. So you can get great results, but it is definitely an outlay of money. So I wouldn't recommend it if you haven't really jumped into it. Try it first, try with some free patterns, try it with fleece, before you jump fully into, well, I've dropped $5,000, time to make some stuffed animals. So if you don't have an embroidery machine, how do you do the eyes? Well, there's a couple of different ideas. Obviously, you can go more handmade looking and use buttons. Also, if you want to do some Coraline dolls, you can use fabric paint, which is what I used on the little nose and the mouth here. You use those tulip squeeze bottle paints that you can get at any craft or fabric store. And if you have a steady hand, you can get some nice detail work for those. You can use felt. And I showed you in this guide, these are felt eyes that are glued onto fur. Additionally, you can layer up felt. So for this piece, I cut out different colors and I glued them all together to make the detailed eye that way. Only thing about that to be careful is that make sure when you position the eyes that you don't put them so that you see them all sticking out the side, because that can look a little strange when they're all bundled up like that. For this one, I kind of split the difference. I used a piece of felt and I hand painted the details on top. Some of the very first plushies that I made were a bunch of the little Luma stars that I cut out black felt eyes and used just a little bit of white fabric paint to make a little bit of a shine on the eyes. It gave a really cute look and it didn't cost a lot of money. Additionally, you can use iron-ons. I did this when I made my little ponies years back. You have to have the file with the eye design on it. I believe I designed some of these out, but you can also find some in like DeviantArt and sites like that. You print it off on iron-on paper, peel off the backing, and then iron those onto the plush. The details for things like the eyelashes were also done in fabric paint. And finally, one other thing you can do is there are safety eyes and noses. If you see a lot of yarn craft like amigurumis, a lot of those use safety eyes for the little black dot eyes. I used safety noses here on Flareon and Leafeon because the nose goes right at the point of the seam. There was really no way to embroider it because there wasn't any fabric there. With a safety nose, it's got a post on the back and then a washer that goes onto it that locks it into place. So they're very simple, but there are also ones that are more detailed, like if you are familiar with the Thai beanie boos that have like the big sparkle eyes, you can get eyeballs like that on Amazon as well. They're safety eyes. So there are different styles out there. You're not gonna find ones that match specific characters though. Like you're not gonna find exactly Mew style eyes. You're gonna find maybe sparkly blue eyes, but that's as close as you're going to get. And then finally, how do you save money in this hobby? You can spend a lot of money if you want to get really into plush making, but you can get started without spending a whole lot. In fact, you can start for about $60 to get a starter set of supplies to make your first couple plushies. The first thing I recommend is to look for sales and look for deals. Get the act from Joann Fabrics. Buy your fleece when it's on sale. Don't feel like you have to buy all your supplies at a fabric store. In fact, I have a metal tray that is magnetic that I use for holding my pins. At Joann's, they have this in the quilting section for about $17. I found the same tray at Harbor Freight for $3.
I was gonna say, I have that for my screws, and it's like, yeah.
Yeah, but you buy it at a fabric store and suddenly it's expensive. Obviously, you're gonna need to buy some of the materials, like you can't go to Harbor Freight and find fleece, unfortunately. But Walmart carries a variety of sewing supplies. You can get scissors there, fabric scissors that are nice. And if you do get a set of fabric scissors, make sure nobody in your family uses them to open Amazon boxes. Make sure you set them aside and you make sure that nobody else is touching them. Because if you use them to cut paper or cardboard, they will double and they won't be so good for fabric anymore. And also I recommend starting with free patterns. You can get some very nice patterns for good money, but you don't have to. For example, this was probably the most expensive pattern I ever bought because the body is very segmented and very fancy. I want to say the full price this pattern was like $30. It had a bunch of options for making other sea serpents and snakes and things, but I waited for the pattern designer to have a sale. So she was running a special, I picked it up on sale.
Also, the Joann's fabric, lots of times they have 50% off coupon. So if you need to buy an expensive item like the scissors or something, save your 50% off for that.
Absolutely, or wait until they have all cutting implements 40% off or something like that. They run unusual sales, so keep apprised to what they have on discount and don't pay full price unless you have that great coupon. Another thing is if you want to make things out of cotton, like little animal clothes, they sell these at Joann's. They're called fabric quarters. It is a quarter yard of fabric that's pre-cut, comes in a lot of different patterns. I picked this up a couple weeks ago when these were $1 each. That's a really good deal if you want to make like Build-A-Bear style clothes. I would definitely not go out there and buy a ton of any one fabric though, unless I'm sure it's something I'm going to use a lot. Like if I know I want to make a whole lot of Pikachus, then sure, I'll buy yards and yards of golden yellow. But if I'm doing a one-off, maybe buy half a yard at a time, not stock up on too much of anything because you also have to store it. And fleece is wonderful fabric that takes up tons of room. So when you are buying your materials, I definitely understand getting really excited and buying a lot of it, but keep in mind that you have to keep it somewhere where it's not going to get dirty or dusty. So you might not want to buy too much at a time. And the final thing I wanted to talk about is that you may have seen this meme going around a couple months ago. It showed somebody's beloved childhood stuffed animal next to a brand new version. And it had the caption, "To be loved is to be changed." If you have a stuffed animal that you love on, and you hug on, and you cuddle on, they're gonna see some wear. And it doesn't matter if it's something that you buy or it's something that you make. Different fabrics are going to wear differently. I mentioned that fleece will get pilly. This is one that was very much cuddled on, and it's definitely been changed. But even if you have something that you carry around a bit at a con as a prop, it's still gonna get a little pilly as well. An example here is Flareon. Flareon is a big favorite in our house. Flareon gets carried around and hugged and is kind of an emotional support animal for our family. Flareon and Creamus here were made with the exact same fluffy fabric. But you can see this isn't quite as fluffy anymore. And that's okay. But different fabrics will wear out a little bit differently. The fabrics that seem to be the most hard wearing are the lower pile Minky and Mochi fabrics. Mochi fabrics, because they're not too fluffy, they won't wear out quite so much. You can carry them around and they're not really going to see a whole lot of damage. In fact, that's one of the reasons I think why Squishmallows are so popular, is that you can have Squishmallows
I have them.
and you can cuddle them and love on them and they're not really going to change all that much. The one difference you're going to see is that stuffing will compress over time when you hug on a plush a whole lot. But if you have the supplies, you can use your trusty seam ripper. Find the seam, don't start poking into the skin of the animal, but find the seam and you can add more stuffing. I've in fact had to do this with a lot of my son's stuffed animals that were his big favorites because bunnies started to get kind of deflated and squished out. So you just get more stuffing, which you know where to get, stuff it up nice and full and happy, and then you can sew it back together. So knowing about how plushies are made can even help you maintain some of the ones that you already have in your collection.